Hi there. There's been a lot of talk this week about the discovery of the so-called obesity gene. But what does it really mean, and what are its implications for people who simply want to lose weight? It's reckoned that about 70% of us have this obesity gene, which predisposes some of us to putting on weight and then having a hell of a long time trying to get rid of that weight. And it makes us more vulnerable to weight than those without the gene. However, does it really change anything for anyone trying to lose weight? I thought I'd go along and ask the very professor who discovered the gene all about it. Does this gene start to explain why, given the fact that we all live in the same environment, why some people seem to have a huge problem and they can't shift it either, despite everything?
I think it's part of the story. I mean, very important to realise this is almost certainly not the only gene that's involved in weight regulation. We've known for some time that weight and obesity are, like many conditions, partly nature, partly nurture, partly genes, partly environment. And this is not going to be the only gene. This happens to be the first gene that we found that's playing a pretty important role, but there will be others that undoubtedly will be discovered in the months and years ahead and give us a much more of a story. I mean, one of the questions that I have been asked a lot in the last few days is whether this explains why obesity is becoming more prevalent, and it clearly can't be. That has to be a consequence of the radical changes in lifestyle and diet that many people across the world are going through. But I suspect that if we'd gone back 100 years, we'd still have found that this gene was present, certainly, and we'd still have found that it was helping to decide which people in that population were heavier and which ones were lighter. Of course, very few people would have been obese in those days, or in pre-war Japan, or any other society you choose to take as an illustration. What, of course, has happened with the environmental change in lives around the world is that the whole distribution of weight has shifted upwards. And this gene, just as it was before, is helping to decide who's heavier and who's thinner. It's doing just the same now. It's just that with more people reaching the sort of figures where we consider them obese or overweight, of course, the gene is then playing a role in deciding which individuals fall into those categories. We come across this gene as part of our study we were doing to try and find actually type 2 diabetes genes originally. We very quickly realized that this particular gene was working through an effect on weight and increasing risk of obesity. And we found that the 16% of people who have 2 copies of the at-risk version of this gene are on average about 3 kilograms heavier, have about a 70% increased risk of obesity and about a 40% risk of type 2 diabetes, as compared with about the 35% who have no copies. So one of the interesting things about this gene is that we know very little about it. It's not a gene that has any prior form in relation to obesity. In fact, it's not a gene that anybody knows very much about at all. And that's both a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because I can't give you a nice story as to how it works and why it is that it leads to problems with weight aggregation and increased risk of obesity and diabetes. But it may well be a blessing because it's taking us somewhere we weren't otherwise going to get to in terms of perhaps understanding something about why it is that some people have an increased risk of obesity and overweight and what the mechanisms are involved might be. And of course the hope there is that we can then translate some of that information into both a better understanding of the condition but also novel treatments and perhaps new ways of intervening.
Well, go on, novel treatments. I mean, what sort of treatment could the discovery of the gene lead to?
We're certainly not talking about, a few people have asked me, we're not talking about altering genes or anything like that. That's way beyond what's possible and probably way beyond what's ethical. So at the moment, one would be thinking either in terms of a drug or possibly of understanding better which particular interventions might work better in particular individuals. So once we understand what this gene does, what the molecules that are involved in translating that effect into a difference in weight is, whether it's working through appetite or exercise or metabolism or any of the things that it could be working through to influence weight, then we can start to look to see if there are any so-called drug targets, any molecules that could be a potential site for thinking about a drug intervention. Now, that's a long way off. The history of the drugs that have previously been made available for treating people who are overweight and obese and wanting to lose weight haven't worked terribly well. They've all often been found to have very serious side effects, and that's certainly made it very difficult, and one of the difficulties. And certainly, I'm not also desperately keen on the idea of medicalising it, but clearly there are some people in whom the other options for treatment just are not effective, and for whom drug therapy, if it was safe and well tolerated, would be an enormous advance.